Hello all. We have Professor Aravind Panagariya with us today. I'm sure all of us know about him, but as a brief introduction, he is a Padma Bhushan recipient. He has been the first vice chair of the Niti Aayog. He is currently a professor in Columbia University, and he actually is a professor of Indian political economy at Columbia University. So we have a great guest to ask some of the questions that we have in our mind regarding economy, trade, in this current scenario where the globe is going through an unprecedented situation on macroeconomics. So Dr. Panagariya, thank you for coming on this chat. So you have been a chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. You have worked with the World Bank, IMF, UNCTAD in various capacities. Now we are going through such a volatile global macroeconomic scenario. So as an opening comment, what would be your broad views on the global economy, the impending recession, or possibly some countries are already in recession, and generally on the geopolitical scenario?
So this is a very wide-ranging question, and certainly, because of the inflation that the United States had been having and it's continuing, the Fed Reserve has been raising interest rates. Similar process has been underway in Europe, and that is creating some bit of a turmoil. Capital is moving especially into the United States from virtually all parts of the world to seek the higher interest rates. So that has led to some depreciation of the currencies, not just the rupee. In fact, rupee has depreciated less, but euro has depreciated quite a bit, and some of the weaker currencies like the Turkish lira has depreciated quite dramatically. Even the Chinese yuan has depreciated more than the rupee. So that is going on. I personally not perturbed really. I think we are handling our macro reasonably well. The Reserve Bank of India actually was quite vigilant, and unlike the Fed Reserve, which was extremely slow to begin responding, the Reserve Bank, once the signs of higher inflation became visible, did act on time. So, and for India, unlike a large number of observers that I see on the media, both in the print as well as the electronic, I am not worried at all. Actually, I think our macro remains robust. Fiscal consolidation can begin to proceed, and some bit of depreciation that has happened was much needed. Perhaps a little more. There is room for a little more, and growth prospects to me look good. My own personal forecasts, for whatever they're worth, are higher than what the other agencies are doing. Both IMF and the World Bank have lowered India's GDP growth rate for 22-23. I think growth rate will turn out to be higher than what both of those institutions, including also the RBI, have been predicting. I will not be surprised in the least if the 22-23 growth rate actually ends up at 8%.
So Dr. Panagariya, that's a good news for India. I think you are bullish on the growth rates for India. But as the RBI is in a way forced to increase its policy rates following the Fed increases, and we know that the inflation in India is primarily not from the demand side, as also in case as in possibly some countries. So with this increasing rates, do you think that you would still stick on if the Fed goes aggressive and RBI has to raise in tandem, the growth will get impacted in say FY24?
First of all, there is a question as to whether RBI should keep raising the interest rates. I think it's time now reassess the situation the next time around as the inflation data begin to come more. I think if you look at month-on-month inflation, that has remained relatively stable, and the 7% or so impact you are seeing is coming principally from the base effect. And so let us wait and watch a little bit more. If prices remain stable, then I think RBI perhaps should let go a little bit off on the brakes, but that's something that will need to be reassessed. Is there some room for further increases in the interest rates? Certainly, right now, the real interest rates are still negative. So it is not as though there is no room, but once the inflation begins to show the signs of coming down, then I think the RBI could begin to go easier. It doesn't stop necessarily. Maybe the increases come down to maybe 25 basis points rather than 50 basis points. That's something that the RBI will have to calibrate. Part of the RBI response, I personally now think, is also to the rising interest rates in the US, in this sense that capital is leaving now, and which causes the rupee to depreciate. And RBI has two policy instruments to deal with the exchange rate. Either it goes out and sells more dollars, or it raises the interest rate. And I suspect that some of the interest rate increases we are seeing now, or we will see in the coming months, if should they happen, would probably also be trying to address the exchange rate issue. But my own take is that I think on that front, I would let the rupee depreciate a little bit more, because rupee certainly has not depreciated more than its competing currencies, and it is essential, absolutely essential, that Indian products remain competitive against the foreign products, and because that helps us both on the import side as well as on the export side, and particularly from the export viewpoint. It is even more critical that we don't want to lose our export markets on account of the exchange rate, which puts our products in the world markets at a disadvantage. So I think this is going to be a wait and watch and act in a measured way for the RBI. But at the moment, I would like to see a few more data points emerge on the GDP before thinking about whether there's going to be a negative impact in 23-24 or not. Let's wait for at least the second quarter figures to come out. That is the second quarter of the FY 22-23, which I think is still about a month and a half away.
So, Dr. Panagariya, so as India has been focusing on exports as one of the engines for growth, as well as generating employment, and we now have an economic partnership with the UAE. We have signed a trade pact with Australia too. There are advanced negotiations with some other countries like UK. Now, in times when there are these murmurs on deglobalization, self-sufficiency, and there is a preference of India for going for bilateral trade agreements over regional trade agreements. So, any comments on this aspect?
Here, of course, the first preference for me actually would be that we would also lower our own external trade barriers. We did that starting from 1991 until about 2007-8. And that served us very well. Actually, the massive expansion of trade that happened accompanied that liberalization, alongside also depreciation of the rupee, because in the 1990s and early 2000s we did let the rupee depreciate significantly, which in a way cushioned a bit against the liberalization, against the import liberalization that had been happening during that period. And of course, predictably, the international trade responded quite dramatically. Merchandise exports from India were about 50 billion around 2002, and they expanded sixfold by 2011 to about 300 billion. So that response does happen to both liberalization and the exchange rate depreciation or rupee depreciation. So something like that has to continue. That will be the first best if we could. I don't think there is stomach for that. I don't think there is willingness on the part of the government, because the government, I think, on this aspect sees things differently. So at least, from that perspective, I'm very pleased that the government has embarked on signing free trade agreements. At least that opens one avenue to liberalization. But what we really need to do is to sign such an agreement with very large economies, and whereas UK is larger than both UAE and Australia, what we really need for liberalization to really pay us handsomely is to sign an agreement with the European Union. Now I hope we continue to advance in that direction, because at the end of the day, I know of no examples of countries that have really done growth rates of 8% or more without being successful in the global marketplace. And that of course requires liberalization. So good progress now. At least we in quick succession we signed 2 of these free trade agreements, but we have to eventually get to much bigger one, which is the European Union.
So, Professor Panagariya, clearly we need to grow our exports, and you said that we need to also lower our barriers. Now, given this, how do we reconcile, or one reconcile this, say, so-called newfound enthusiasm for the FTAs with the self-reliant initiatives that India is also having towards promoting domestically produced goods over imported goods?
One is that self-reliance obviously doesn't mean self-sufficiency. I'm self-reliant because I pay all my bills, but I'm not self-sufficient. I have to sell my services to Columbia University and then get my salary, and then I buy a number of different things from different sellers depending on who sells me cheap. Wherever I can find better prices is where I purchase my goods. So as long as I'm not incurring any debt, I am self-reliant. And that goes for the countries as well, that as long as they are not counting on too much foreign debt, they are self-reliant. But that doesn't mean that you don't trade. When you export, you are producing at home, and you are producing those products at which you are the best at, because you won't be able to export them unless you are actually best at them. So why do we want to produce what you are the worst at, which is products that require the highest level of protection to produce at home, like the automobiles we are doing? Actually, to give you a provocative answer to a provocative question, that 100% tariffs, if really auto industry thinks that it is all the robust industry that it claims to be, let it compete. Why are you punishing the customers who have to pay 1.5 to twice the price that anybody else buying the same automobile outside India has to pay? And so that is not in the interest of the country itself. Produce what you are the best at, and that is the set of products that you are going to export. And then you can, when you import, you are paying for them, you are not getting them for free. Whereas when you are going to cut the imports through protection, you are going to encourage the less efficient industries, and you are going to punish your exporters, because ultimately capital is going to flow out of the more efficient industries into these less efficient industries. So it's not as though you are what you are doing is, by protecting, you are encouraging one set of industries without hurting any others, and therefore you are adding net you are adding to the total GDP. That's not how it works. Ultimately, the capital has to come from the other industries which are more efficient but unprotected like the import competing industries, and that is only going to make you less efficient, welfare reducing. What you want to do really actually is to reverse that process. Move your resources, move capital into industries where we are the best, and globally best, that is. And that is the whole logic of specialization via international trade.
On that note, so clearly, Ms. that brings us to as to why this global supply chains came up, and we need to be part of the global supply chain and compete in what we do most efficiently. Now, we have been seeing major disruptions in the global supply chain over the last few years, and clearly that kind of brings in risks to the local economy also. So, any measures that you believe India should be undertaking towards mitigating the risks that it faces from such global supply chain disruptions?
If you look at the disruptions in the supply chains, they are largely the result of COVID or the pandemic, which disrupted a lot of things. And I won't worry too much on that account, because in the end, whenever there is such a massive global shock, supply chains will get disrupted and they will be restored. And I have no doubt, that when these disruptions happen on account of external shocks, supply chains do rebuild themselves. Now, I think it can nevertheless work to India's advantage, because one thing that has happened, which has a longer-term significance during this COVID shock, is that the confidence in China has considerably been reduced on the part of investors. A lot of the multinationals now see and fear that the Chinese government is turning inward. It is also continues to be actually unreliable in terms of its COVID policy, and in general there is the fear also because of the policy actions of China against many of its own companies in recent years, and that actually opens up an opportunity for India, most multinationals are now looking for China plus one strategy, meaning they're looking for at least another location for their production activities, and that is where we need to take advantage of it. For that, of course, the list of reforms that India still has to undertake is quite long. That's a list of reforms actually which applies to not just foreign investors but domestic investors as well. I think both of them will flourish, and therefore India will flourish on that count. One last thing in this context I would say is that there is this sense that gets a lot of play in the media, that somehow there is deglobalization happening. In fact, if you go for a few months back, even The Economist ran this cover page story, how to re-globalize. I think this is again completely nonsensical, because if you look at what is happening in the international trade arena, hardly any deglobalization has happened. International trade or exports and merchandise, goods exports used to be about 6.5 trillion in the year 2000. I mean, that's when China was entering the global trade on a very large scale. Pre-COVID peak was about 19 trillion. That was in 2018. And already in 2021, when COVID was still not gone, Delta wave actually hit us in 2021. And even then, the global trade had crossed $22 trillion. So it had actually beaten the previous peak of 19 trillion in 2018 by 3 trillion. So, determined exporters find ways to send their products to the other countries. Importers who need their products find their ways to get the products. For the first quarter of 2022, trade has expanded about 16% over the first quarter of the previous year. So, trade is growing, going to continue to grow. Those who actually see an opportunity in it and therefore get their house in order to take advantage will succeed. Those who fear the global markets and turn towards their own would perhaps not take enough advantage of the global economy, and that will be a pity.
So, Professor Panagariya, you have authored several books like India, the Emerging Giant, which came out in 2008, and it was a topic of The Economist in that year. How do you perceive India of today than India of 2008, and some of the things that you had mentioned in the book? Do you think that those have come to fruition? What would be your because post-COVID world, there is the leadership styles, the hybrid ways in which working has come, the young demography that we have. Do you think that the way you saw in 2008 India as the emerging giant, is it on the path of continuing in that path, or has it actually exceeded your expectations? What would be your commentary?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So let me first say that one of the reviewers of India, the Emerging Giant, had quipped, quoting Steve Cohen, who used to be an India expert at Brookings Institution. So he recalled, this reviewer, Steve Cohen, as saying that, it seems that India is always emerging but never arriving. And so first thing I should say is that very happily, if I were to actually write a similar book today, I will certainly not call it India, the Emerging Giant. India has arrived. It's the fifth largest economy today. And in my view, I think it will become third largest in 6 or 7 years. Even actually not, after I wrote the column in the Times of India, the IMF has gone ahead and said the same thing. If you look up, it says in 2027-28, India will become the third largest. India practically has arrived for all practical purposes. So I'll not have to. I remember actually at that time having a debate with Shankaracharya, who is the eternal skeptic, and I am the opposite, the eternal optimist. And he's saying that this growth rate, which is, if you read the introduction to my book, India, the Emerging Giant, I discuss this whole issue of whether India has actually entered a high growth trajectory now, or it is simply a cyclical effect and that will disappear. And I took the view that no, this is India has actually moved into a higher growth trajectory, and it's not a cyclical one, which was the argument. Shankaracharya was arguing that this will probably go back down to the low growth rate of 5% or so. Didn't happen. Now 2003 to 2019, or 2003-4 to 19-20, average growth in India has exceeded 7%. We have sustained that kind of real growth rate for 17 years. Then COVID, of course, dented it, but we are returning to that 7 to 8% trajectory already. So that part, I think, very much just as I had expected. On policy side, some of the things that at that time may have looked like I was imagining things, but have happened. Meaning that I was through the entire book runs the theme. When I talk about many of these social policies, I say that look, cash transfers can do better. At that time, nobody was listening. In fact, I remember going into debates on when the Food Security Act was being enacted, which is almost 2013, 5 years after this book. And I was the lone kind of advocate of cash transfers at the time. Whenever I would go into this, I was actually opposed to the Food Security Act in the form in which it was being brought up, because I just said, spend that money on cash transfers. Now, of course, no government has the stomach to reverse any or withdraw any of the social expenditures that have been put in place. So NREGA is there, Food Security Act is there. Nevertheless, cash transfers have begun, and cash transfers it has become really the preferred way of doing things of the government nowadays.
That's a wonderful perspective we got, Professor Panagariya. Now, coming to a little bit of towards the close of this interview, what you will rate as your most rewarding experience over the years? And if you had a chance to go back in the past and alter something, what you would have done differently?
Although that was the wish of my father, his dream was to turn me into an IAS officer. But perhaps the fate had something else in it for me. So now, for me it has been very enjoyable. Whatever I've done, I've enjoyed very much. When I came to Niti Aayog, I was really very scared that this is something, a gigantic responsibility, and a lot of apprehensions whether I was up to it or not. But looking back, I think I feel proud of what I was able to do and accomplish at the Niti Aayog. And indeed, from my personal perspective, probably those were the best 3 years by far of my professional life. But we all evolve, and we enjoy the evolution also. So, and I certainly, for an academic, I have evolved quite a bit. And my current book is on the Nehru era, how it impacted the Indian trajectory. So this is a very heavy economic history of economic thought of that period. In terms of what would I like to change, well, we don't know. If I were unhappy with how life has been, then I would perhaps speculate, oh, I wish it was this way, or I wish that way, but that's certainly not the case. So, and given where we started, we were a very, very ordinary family, and if you got, middle class, if you could call it that, because in those days even middle class are today's poor. So I and my brother, we all went to Hindi medium schools and all, and nothing of the kinds of schools to which most of the people I meet now went to. And that certainly, at the end of the day, we came out of it. And that experience actually, turned out to be very, very valuable, because you have seen that firsthand, and so it does put brakes on you turning arrogant on issues, or it keeps you humble.
Thank you so much, Professor Panagariya. And I think we not only got lessons in economics, macroeconomics, trade, but we also got some life lessons in those concluding remarks, and how we should be an optimist and stay with hope in this gloomy macroeconomic environment also. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Ranen. Thanks for having me for this very interesting exchange.